Welcome to a miscellaneous reading diary. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today is the first episode of 2 total that I will be doing about a book that I missed a good while back, as you saw in the title and thumbnail, Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. And this book, like I said, I did miss it a little while back. I was once upon a time part of a read-along that we called Monthly Classics, where basically every month we read a different classic book of some sort that we got to vote on, and the winner of whatever vote we got to do was the book that we read in any given month. Sometimes for thicker books like this it took a couple of months, but when Don Quixote was the selected winner for Monthly Classics, I can't remember when it was at this point. I want to say probably like August of 2023 or somewhere thereabouts. I missed this. Didn't have time to actually read it at that point and said that I would circle back around to it, and I am finally doing that. So today we will be covering the first half of the book, or if you know anything about Don Quixote, part 1, or technically parts 1 through 4, which make up part 1. It's a little bit of a confusing structure, but that's the way things go. So right about the first half of the book, about 49% of Don Quixote will be covered today, and then on the first Thursday of October. So, and I believe 5 weeks from now will be when I cover part 2, or the back half of Don Quixote, and talk about all of that. So that is what we're doing today. I thought I might be able to get through the whole book in August once upon a time when I started reading this, but various different things didn't line up well enough, so that wasn't very feasible. So instead of both of these diaries coming out in August like I had planned to, actually, now they're coming out in September, October. That's the way things go. So let's talk about a little bit briefly some spoiler-free impressions of Don Quixote. And I gotta say, there's some things that I really like about this book. There's some things that I don't like as much about this book, and the things that I don't like are probably going to seem a little bit ironic, which I guess is kind of fitting for the book in its own special way. But like I said earlier, part 1 of Don Quixote is technically in itself made up of 4 different parts, and this was one of the things that kind of threw me off a little bit, because these 4 parts aren't really split in very, I guess, readily normal ways. There's a mild kind of frame narrative going on here, not in the sense that the narrator is in himself like a character of the book. The narrator of the book is supposedly Cervantes himself, having discovered documents or something like that telling about the life of Don Quixote, and he is just, transcribing some of that history of Don Quixote for us. But the problem with this, I guess this approach to the story, this meta story narrative, I guess, if you want to consider it like that, doesn't really work for me, I gotta be honest. Like, every time it kind of cuts back into the narrator speaking as the author, it just gets weird and doesn't really say or do anything. Like, for example, the end of part 1, not the end of the whole first half of the book, but the end of part 1 within part 1 ends with Cervantes, the author, supposedly saying, oh, but herein ends this tale, or this part of the tale in the middle of this sequence, because the rest of it just isn't here. And then the beginning of part 2 within part 1 there is Cervantes going through and saying, oh, but I found this person who had some of these documents that seemed like they might have been from Don Quixote, but they were written in a different language, so I had to get somebody else to translate this portion of the tale, and so that I could relate it to you. And then it starts kind of miraculously at the point where part 1 in there ended, and then continues on from there. But like, for the most part, this sort of meta-narrative structure of the book, at least of part 1 of the whole first half of Don Quixote, does not really work for me. There's no real purpose that it's actually serving, considering that Don Quixote is like one of the foundational novels. Like, without Don Quixote, we might not have novels the way that we think of them today. But even with that context in mind, like, this is a pretty early iteration of that kind of format, it's still like, it just doesn't work, Something about it just doesn't click for me. It feels pretty pointless. It feels like, just random self-inserts in weird and ironic ways, especially since throughout this whole first half of the story, you get very many moments, or at least a handful of end notes within the book kind of call to certain references of other tales of knights and chivalry and stuff like that. Some of those I feel like would probably be a benefit if I'd read some of those before this, such as like Arya Stowe's, what's it called? Why am I forgetting off the top of my head at this point? Orlando Furioso. That's the one that I'm thinking of. That one especially is referenced quite often. There are some others that are referenced. There are some that seem like they're probably made up, so a little bit of the kind of ironic, the irony-laden kind of focus of Don Quixote as a whole. But there are also a couple of like Cervantes's own like poetry and his own works that he had previously written prior to Don Quixote that are referenced in here, which feel a little bit strange in the context of Don Quixote supposedly transcribing the life of Don Quixote. Like I said, there's just this meta-narrative aspect that doesn't really work for me, but there are still plenty of things that I do like, such as like in the first part of part one, you have Don Quixote actually becoming the knight Don Quixote. You kind of have that exploration of how Quijana, or whatever his actual name is, kind of getting obsessed with tales of knightly chivalry and deciding that he's going to be a knight errant and then becoming the knight. That part is really super amusing. I enjoyed a lot of that stuff. And when the meta story isn't really getting in the way, it still finds itself being amusing at a lot of different points. But I would say that the story swings between being really entertaining and sort of amusing as a side note there to, I would say, like kind of overly drawn out so as to ruin the pacing at times, depending on how certain sections kind of feel. Don Quixote himself as a character, as he kind of, after he becomes the knight and he's going on these adventures, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, I don't really like this stuff very much. It is very ironic that reading a book called Don Quixote and expecting it to be this kind of amusing, somewhat ironic, even satirical kind of tale of knight errants and chivalry and stuff like that. All of the stuff about Don Quixote and Sancho Panza is by far the stuff in the book that I am enjoying the least, which is, it's kind of a plus and a minus in a way, because that means that like the title character, the character I'm going to be following for the whole back half of the book in part two, is not one that I'm connecting with very much. Sancho Panza, I'm not really enjoying his attitude very much either. I don't find them as, I guess, humorously amusing as I feel like I should or like I'm supposed to. I just find myself a little bit more irritated by their characters, by their behavioral tendencies than I am by anything else. Or I am more irritated than I am anything else, I suppose is the way that I should put that. So it's kind of weird that I'm not enjoying it. But yeah, Don Quixote just kind of ruins the story for me. If we split part one into those first four parts, like 1, 2, 3, and 4, I would say like part 4 is probably my favorite. Part 3 has a lot of good stuff. Part 2 has some good stuff in it as well, but it's kind of hard to remember specifically what each part entails because the splits are very arbitrary and kind of silly in the first place. But I guess after the first half of part 1, is right about when Don Quixote's antics and Sancho Panza as well, kind of relatedly, just started becoming more frustrating and annoying than they were amusing or humorous to any degree. I honestly rarely found myself outright amused by these characters or by their specific tales. I feel like I should be, but I just haven't really been amused by it, which is pretty unfortunate. But the other side of the story here is that while I'm not enjoying Don Quixote's character very much, or his particular tales, I am enjoying all of the stuff that isn't directly related to him a lot. And the real irony inherent to this particular praise is the fact that, at least within part 1 of the book, there's a ton of material that isn't about Don Quixote. In fact, I would probably wager that more than half of the book up to this point, like if we take, the first half, so I guess if we're speaking a little bit more properly, I'm sorry, this is getting confusing probably, right around a quarter of Don Quixote is just not Don Quixote, actually. It's other characters' tales. It's other extraneous stuff kind of happening. It's probably more than a quarter of the book that's like that, maybe even upwards of a third, and all of that material is great. But it is at this point that I'm going to shift the talk into a little bit more spoiler-oriented stuff there's not really a ton to properly spoil about Don Quixote, but I am going to be talking about some of these, extraneous tales that are happening, a couple of specific scenes and stuff, so they do count as spoilers enough that I feel like if you haven't read Don Quixote, I think that the first half is enjoyable to read for the side stories, but I totally get it if you aren't super interested in it. So, just be aware that I'm going to talk a little bit about spoilers here and talk about, notable scenes, like some of my favorite moments, funny scenes, or general, more specific instances of things that I actually enjoyed or didn't. One particular thing, that I found pretty surprising about Don Quixote was how early, like the windmill scene, for example, takes place. That's a pretty iconic moment within this book where Don Quixote mistakes a bunch of windmills as like a horde of giants, for example, and goes to try to attack them, and somehow injures himself in the process. And that scene is it is iconic. It is very memorable in a sense, particularly because it is one of the earliest of these types of scenes of Don Quixote just being crazy and delusional, whether purposely so or whether because he actually is. The book kind of seems to indicate that he isn't actually crazy. He has sense, unless it's about knight errantry stuff, in which case he just is completely off his rocker. So, there's probably meant to be a little bit of reader interpretation involved here, but the windmill scene is pretty indicative overall of kind of what you're going to get whenever you're following Don Quixote and Sancho Panza on their adventuring, where you're going to have Don Quixote talking about these crazy things, seeing these crazy things, doing these crazy things, and finding out that, yeah, they are in fact all insanely crazy because none of them are actually happening. And, from an external narrative perspective, from the narrator's point of view, or even from Sancho Panza's point of view, you're told that, like, none of these things that Don Quixote thinks X or Y thing is what he thinks it is. It's actually something completely normal, and he's just taking it completely out of context, out of like some delusional knight errantry bizarreness. And one of the things that bothered me the most about this was like a particular inn that becomes a recurring location within the first half of the book, where a lot of some amusing things happen. Like there's some stuff that happens within part one, early on in part one, that is pretty amusing, where you have, let's say, I have notes on this somewhere. It's an inn where there's a daughter and also like an extra servant that are kind of involved with working at this inn, with the mother and father that kind of own it, I think is how things are kind of going. There's the innkeeper, wife, daughter, and like extra servant. So you have this inn that's like a location that Don Quixote is convinced is actually just a castle. And this becomes a recurring scene, but he's also convinced not just that this is a castle, but that this inn is just a place filled with enchanters and, enchantments in general, where everything that happens in this inn is affected to some degree by enchanting, where if Don Quixote were to just open his mind for 2.5 milliseconds, he would realize how stupid he sounds. But he's like just so convinced that, like, no, this is a castle, and this is enchantments are happening. Being enchanted is why misfortune is visiting me and my squire Sancho Panza. But like, it's so far-fetched and absurd that I find it actually hard to appreciate or to take seriously in any degree. And I know that like taking Don Quixote seriously, quote unquote, isn't necessarily the point. Like, I get that much. The problem that I have is that the line between like acceptable absurdity and what is just too much absurdity for me to even really consider it being entertaining at that point, it's like it's far above, it is far beyond that line most of the time, where Don Quixote's antics, especially in relativity to all of the other characters, is just so much that I find him annoying and insufferable, rather than any form of charming or amusing or funny or anything along those lines. And I don't think this in particular, you might be inclined to say that like this might be a translation issue. I don't think it is. John Rutherford is one of probably the 2 or 3 best translations as far as I could tell, based off of like general recommendations and stuff for keeping like the humor and the spirit of that wit and stuff. And there are plenty of moments that got chuckles early on in the book. I found pretty amusing, quite a bit of stuff, But as a whole, I think it's generally just the strict line of absurdity that Don Quixote and kind of Sancho Panza as a bridge there, where they actually reside in relativity to the rest of the characters and the rest of the world, and especially the more dramatic moments. This absurdity just doesn't work. Like I said, I don't think this is a translation issue. I think this is inherent to those characters and kind of the tone, the vibe that is being sought for with those characters, and I just don't think that works for me. So that doesn't work. But I did mention just there a little bit ago about dramatic moments. Dramatic moments is pretty interesting with the first half of Don Quixote. Like I said before in the spoiler-free section, there's like more than half of the first half of the book, more than a quarter of this book doesn't even have anything to do with Don Quixote, or if it does, it's tangentially enough that it's not really Don Quixote stuff anymore. It's dramatic, extraneous tales. These are instances of like the Sierra Morena content is a lot of stuff that I really enjoyed in spite of the Don Quixote isms because of a character called Cardenio telling his tale about how he's a wretch and he's kind of chosen to live isolated out in the desert, kind of half crazy because of some misfortunes that he experienced with his love life, with his lover, his marriage kind of falling apart at the hands of somebody he served. And something that he couldn't really do anything about, just kind of the despair that this character feels about this situation. You have another moment in the Sierra Morena where you also have Dorothea, another character who has a very similar story, but then you find out that Dorothea and Cardenio, their stories are very lined up. Cardenio's, I guess, master, you could say, who kind of steals his wife from him, that's a whole, kind of triangle of complications there, but Dorothea is also around here, and she's actually technically the betrothed of Cardenio's master. So you have like a four-way string of characters that are all kind of related to each other in some sense, and this becomes dramatic tension. You have both of these characters telling their tales and their despair. They're being distraught at what has happened to them, and these tales are really engaging. I loved them a ton. You also have later moments within this part where you're back at the inn, that reoccurring inn section, but where you see some convergence of some of these storylines actually come into play, where Ferdinand, Cardenio's master, and then Lucinda, who's Cardenio's actual wife, actually show up. They're kind of traveling here. So it turns out these four characters who are kind of in their weird associations with one another are all now together. You hear those tales, and then you have these characters interacting and basically kind of making a form of ideal do to each other. Like, okay, well, Cardenio, my wife Lucinda, she's my wife, and then Dorothea is just like, hey, Ferdinand, you promised me you would marry me, so let's go together. So now you have these pairs kind of in their proper order, and that's entertaining. Like, all of this stuff with these characters was really super entertaining to me. Also at the end, you have moments where some of the other characters kind of more related to the Don Quixote plotline, like the priest and the barber, I guess. These two characters are kind of involved with trying to help Don Quixote get back to his original town so that they can, kind of save him, I guess, from being just entrenched in this deluded knight chivalry act charade of his. But these characters, the priest, comes across a tale called, I think it's the story of inappropriate curiosity or something like that, which is like a written story of chivalry that exists within Don Quixote. And like, that tale is also really good, question mark. Like, it's quite something for sure, the content of it being about a man who is so convinced that he wants to be more convinced that his wife is going to be faithful to him, and that his wife isn't unfaithful to him, and so tries to get his best friend to tempt his wife into being unfaithful to ensure that she's being faithful. Of course, hearing that kind of summary, you kind of know where that story is going to go. Of course, it being titled Inappropriate Curiosity kind of helps in that way, kind of telling you what exactly is going to happen in there. And you get to see that tale kind of unravel, where this man basically causes his own demise by insisting that his best friend try to tempt his wife, and his best friend not really wanting to for obvious reasons, and then ending up kind of involved with it unwittingly anyway. And of course, all the dramatic twists and turns that occur in that story. That story was also super entertaining. It didn't really have much to do with the main book itself, but like there's not really a plot to Don Quixote anyway, so who cares, right? It was just an entertaining tale, and that was really fun. You also have a couple of other characters that you come across at some point in the book, like basically what we call the captive's tale, which is, I guess the characters are named Roy Perez de Viedma and Zoraida Lamore, or rather Zoraida the Moor. And these two characters, the captive's tale, like I said, this tale is kind of more in line with like Cardenio and Dorothea, kind of recounting their stories. The captive's tale is also really good. Like actually just legitimately an incredible story. I really liked that portion of the book. Like I've said, it was basically all of the non-Quixote stuff within Don Quixote up to this point that I've enjoyed the most, because it is basically after the end stuff is done, after all of this convergence of these various characters that we've heard dramatic tales from, when those kind of go their separate ways to one degree or another, you have Don Quixote basically being taken captive at the end of part one, near the end of part one anyway, and that point, the last handful of chapters from then on is just not really that enjoyable to me, which is kind of another nail in the coffin as far as my feelings for Don Quixote's portion of the story is concerned. I just don't really enjoy it that much. So like all of the dramatic stories that are outside of Don Quixote, love those. Everything having to do with Don Quixote, that more humorous, satirical, ironic side of the storytelling just doesn't click for me. It doesn't really work. I found myself generally frustrated by the long-winded absurdities of Don Quixote as well. Just kind of him as a character just kind of puts me off a lot. I don't like him. And like I kind of suggested earlier, I'm also pretty frustrated by Sancho Panza's idiocy and also his complicity with Quixote. I don't find it really believable or enjoyable to follow to any serious degree, unfortunately. And I should also state here at the end of the spoiler section that the Don Quixote, this first part of it, kind of ends with that meta story kind of jumping in again, where you have, Don Quixote being made captive at the end of part one, or near the end of part one. But then, like, basically at the end, it's just like, oh yeah, Don Quixote is taken home, he's taken care of, he's kind of helped a little bit. Oh, but then he disappears again, going off on another adventure. But oh no, me, the narrator, Cervantes, doesn't have the information for what happens there. All I know is that I have these kind of inscriptions that exist on various stones from elsewhere around the world, like the graves of like Don Quixote and Sancho Panza and like some other people, and like memorials built to some of these characters. So like I know they went on other adventures. They're dead now, but that's the end of this story. Maybe one day we will have more adventures of Don Quixote, but maybe we won't. But that's the end. And that's how part one ends. And I didn't really like that either. I found that to be kind of silly. I mean, sure, it obviously opened up the ability to write part two of the book, and part two of Don Quixote, the back half of it was written like a decade after the first part was. But like, I just didn't find that close to part one to be very engaging, because I didn't find any of that sort of meta-narrative type of thing to be very interesting in the first place. Just overall, didn't really work for me. I found that pretty unfortunate. But to kind of wrap things up, let's just say I have highly enjoyed what I've read so far of Don Quixote, in spite of the titular character. All the side stuff is by far easily what I've enjoyed the most. The dramatic tales told by other characters of their own stories, that kind of stuff is by far what I've enjoyed the most about this book. All of that has been super fun. And at this point, my hope for part two is that its tone is going to be a little bit different. I've heard that the tone of part two of Don Quixote is different than the first part, not least because of the 10 years that separated the writing of those two portions. And given that all of the more serious kind of dramatic stuff about part one was what I enjoyed the most, I'm hoping that the more silly, humorous, satirical, ironic side of the story isn't really as much of a focus in part two, because if that's what part 2 is also doing with Don Quixote, with those characters, and there's not any of that side stuff to keep me engaged, it might be a pretty miserable time, because yeah, I just didn't really enjoy Don Quixote, I didn't enjoy Sancho Panza very much, I didn't enjoy their tales, I didn't enjoy their adventuring, I enjoyed all the stuff that was happening around their adventuring and tales, and I guess sort of as a result of their adventuring, but like them themselves and their actual adventures, that kind of stuff, not quite so much. So at this point, I'm just hoping that part 2 is a little bit more serious, a little bit more dramatic, that there's a tonal shift and that it takes it away from the particular satirical tone that is the first part. So I guess we'll have to see what happens. But that's going to do it for this video. I will be reading part 2 of Don Quixote, the back half of this book, in September, probably in the back half of September, middle of the month or so is probably when I'm going to get around to that. I have Crossroads of Twilight that I'm going to be reading. At the time that I'm recording this, I have already started reading Crossroads of Twilight, and over the next 4 Thursdays will be the reading diaries for that book, for book 10 of Wheel of Time. And then the first Thursday of October is when my diary on part 2 of Don Quixote will be, and I believe my review of the book itself will probably be in October as well. So if you want to hear more about how I'm feeling about this book, my bi-weekly updates over the next month or so should probably go over to some degree very briefly how I'm feeling about part 2 once I'm actually getting to starting that, but definitely check out the next diary for this in about a month's time. And then the review of it, of course, I'll kind of wrap everything up in a more concise and generally spoiler-free manner. So yeah, that is kind of the plan at this moment. If you checked out this video, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.